My name's Dave Brannigan. I'm the Division Director for Decision and Infrastructure Sciences. And on behalf of my colleagues, it's my great pleasure to welcome you and thank you for coming to Argonne National Laboratory. For more than 3 decades, Argonne National Laboratory has supported Department of Energy and other federal sponsor priorities in the characterization, assessment, and analysis of the critical infrastructure of our nation. It still is a central pillar of the work that we conduct today. We're really interested in helping stakeholders reduce their risk and enhance their resiliency with regards to critical infrastructure. Central to that is deep understanding and technical expertise related to the electricity power grid. So we're delighted you're going to hear a great depth and detail about our scientific capabilities, our technical capabilities with regards to ensuring the safety and security, the overall resilience of the electricity power grid. So with that, I'd like to welcome everyone again to our 3rd Argonne OutLoud lecture of 2019, Ensuring a Resilient Power Grid. But before I introduce the speaker, we'd like to whet your appetite a little bit with an introductory video.
You double-clicked.
Let's play it again.
You have to be very careful with that clicker, I learned. Go back to the original slide. Now click once.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce our OutLoud speaker, Dr. Mark Petri. Mark is Argonne's Electric Power Grid Program Director, and he coordinates Argonne's wide range of electric power research and development. Mark received his PhD from Purdue University and first joined Argonne in 1989. In his tenure at Argonne, he's been involved in many programs, including advanced nuclear reactor development, international nuclear safety, and renewable energy and efficiency research. Please welcome Mark to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you, Dave. Good evening. Did you enjoy the world premiere of our new little introductory video? It's pretty exciting to see that. We didn't finish it until about noon today. So, and one other shout out I want to make. I saw a gentleman here with a Bears shirt, and to his credit and to the rest of you, I know that the Bears are playing tonight. So it's a testament to your interest in these important topics that you came here tonight, and I really appreciate it. So many people don't realize how critical the electric power grid is to really everything in our everyday lives, and just how disruptive it can be when the power goes out. And this first really hit home for me in August of 2003 when the Northeast suffered from a major blackout. Do people remember the 2003 blackout? Were people affected by that? I see a lot of nodding heads here. Just to remind folks who don't remember, or was so long ago, 55 million people were without power, and it took up to 2 weeks for the power to be restored. And this is what really struck me. When that happened, water supply was cut, raw sewage was dumped, ATMs and banks wouldn't work, the telephones wouldn't work, even the dairy cattle couldn't be milked. And so the electric power grid was central to all of that. So so we're all on the same page, what do we mean when we talk about the electric power grid? So traditionally, the grid has consisted of central generating stations that produce power, send it through transmission lines cross country, and then at lower voltages it moves into the distribution system past substations to provide power to our homes and our businesses. And these features still exist today, but the picture has definitely been evolving, because today we have variable generation, wind farms that are distributed throughout the countryside. We have solar panels on people's roofs. We have electric vehicles. People talk about microgrids. We have battery systems that are installed both in people's homes and on the grid system itself. There's much more data that's being collected and a lot of automation. So in general, these changes have done a lot to improve the efficiency and the operations of the electric power grid. But a question that I want to ask is, has this really improved the reliability of the grid? So the Energy Information Administration has, since 2013, has been collecting reliability data from the system. So system operators and utilities report frequency and duration of power outages, and they usually limit it to power outages that are greater than at least 5 minutes. And they've been reporting this to the Energy Information Agency. So what you're seeing here is that, yes, there has been some drop from initially in 2013, and what we're looking at here is the average power interruptions per customer. And these numbers that I calculated are a broad US average, so your mileage may vary on this. But you see that since 2014, the numbers have been pretty flat, that for these kind of outages that are at least 5 minutes long, every one of us experiences about 1.5 per year. And that's, I don't know, that's kind of been my experience at my house. I get all these little intermittent outages more frequently, but for something that lasts a little bit longer, yeah, a couple times a year, that sounds about right. So, but the other metric to look at is how long are these outages? I said that these are at least 5 minutes, but if you don't count major outage events, you can see that the outage length per disruption has held pretty steady since 2013. It's about 1.5 hours per disruption. But if you start counting major events, you can see that the number has gone up tremendously, from about 1 hour per disruption to over 6 hours per disruption. That's 6 hours per disruption on average in the US. So what do we make of this? So here's my interpretation. My interpretation is that these changes that have taken place in the electric power grid have done a lot to improve reliability, or at least not make reliability any worse. But what we're seeing is increasingly severe assaults against the grid system that are leading to these kind of disruptions. So what do I mean by that? Well, some of the challenges that we're facing come from the evolution of the grid itself. We do have more variable generation and demand on the system that makes it difficult to manage and control. Think of intermittent renewable energy sources on the grid. Also, these days there's a blending of the distribution system and the transmission system. Now that we have all of these consumer choices at the edge in the distribution system, putting solar panels on your roof and plugging in electric vehicles and putting battery systems in. These days, unlike that traditional system that we originally talked about, if there are perturbations that take place on the distribution system, those can propagate back up into the transmission system. And so this makes managing the grid more complicated. Likewise, there's been a growing set of interdependencies among critical infrastructures. So we have the electric power grid. Remember the example of the Northeast blackout. Now we need to think about the interactions between the electric power grid system and other critical infrastructures such as telecommunications and water and oil and transportation. And disruptions that take place in those systems can also back up and create problems on the electrical grid system. So that may have been a little confusing, but let me give you a specific example. Let's look at the natural gas pipeline system. So just as kind of a reminder, we already get 36% of our power from natural gas. And as electricity demand is expected to grow over the next several years out to 2050, the expectation is that the percentage of generation coming from natural gas is going to top 40%. So if you think about it, electricity is needed to keep that natural gas flowing. We need it for pumps and compressor stations and things like that. And these days, more and more, disruptions that take place on the natural gas pipeline system can significantly curtail the generation on the electricity side. And therefore, these are coupled systems that we need to think about. So aside from these structural changes that we've been seeing in the grid, we also have to think about a growing number of external threats to the system. And I hardly need to mention what we see in the news just over the past few months. Earthquakes in California, polar vortices in Illinois and the New England states, hurricanes in the Gulf and the Atlantic, wildfires out west. And if you've attended these OutLoud lectures in the past, you know that Argonne does a lot of good work on long-term extreme weather event forecasting across the entire United States. So if you've seen those lectures, you know that there's every expectation that as we move into the future, we're going to see more heat waves, more extreme storms, more wildfires. And this is only going to make our challenges with the electric power grid all the more greater. Finally, hardly a day goes by without us reading about someone trying to hack into the electric power grid system and other critical infrastructure. Now, we've been lucky in the United States that there's been little serious damage to our systems from these kind of cyber attacks. But we have seen power disrupted in other countries, such as Ukraine. So this is certainly a real threat that we need to think about, and one could expect it to grow in the future as well. So here's a really nice graph that I found in July of 2017 that captures government data on the cost of hurricanes. And you can see here's Katrina in 2005. Estimated cost is $160 billion. By the way, all of these numbers have been converted to be equivalent in 2017 dollars. There's Superstorm Sandy from 2012 at $70 billion. Remember, this was from July of 2017 that this graph was made. What happened in September of 2017? Well, we had Hurricane Harvey. That's upwards to $180 billion. On the heels of that, we had Hurricane Irma. That was at $49 billion. And Hurricane Maria was the third costliest hurricane in U.S. history. The official governor's report from Puerto Rico estimates that it will take $132 billion to totally restore the infrastructure system on the island. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about Maria, because well, you'll see in a moment that Argonne had a lot of involvement with this. We should have some animation here. I don't know why we're not getting our nice little animation. There we go, that's a little better. So September 20th of 2017, that was when the eye of Maria hit the island as a high-end Category 4 hurricane. Power was not fully restored until August of 2018. That's 11 months later. The official estimate is that 2,975 people died because of Hurricane Maria. And most of that wasn't because of the initial storm itself, but it was because of that long-term power outage meant that there was a lack of clean water and health care and other vital services. So Maria ended up being the third most deadly hurricane in US history. And in fact, you have to go all the way back to the year 1900 to the Galveston hurricane to find a more serious event than took place here. Now, this may surprise you, thinking of Argonne as a research institution, but we were deeply involved in the response and recovery operations in Puerto Rico. Even as Maria was heading towards landfall, Argonne was tracking the storm and providing forecasts of what the damage would be to the electrical power grid system. We had people on the ground working with FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers to assess the damage and help prioritize restoration. And Argonne led the initial stages of a multi-lab Department of Energy effort to take tools and software that the laboratories have developed and transfer them to Puerto Rico and the grid operators there so that they'd be better prepared for future storms with a more resilient grid system. And right now, if you're reading the news, you know about Hurricane Dorian. So Dorian, thankfully, skirted to the north of Puerto Rico, and so there was limited damage there. Nonetheless, there was significant rainfall and flooding in Puerto Rico. They did lose some power. And Argonne has, of course, been tracking this storm and providing updates to Puerto Rico so that they can better prepare where to send the crews ahead of time. In fact, this morning I had a conversation with the grid operator in Puerto Rico who let me know that the island has been spared from the worst damage that they might have anticipated, and that the grid has been resilient and has held up well against this storm. So that's the second time I used this term resilient. And you remember when I was showing you data before, I was talking about grid reliability. So what's the difference? What's the difference between reliability and resilience? So reliability is basically how effective the system is at delivering power when I need it and at the quality that I need it, that the voltage is stable. So it's basically, are the lights on when I expect the lights to be on? Resiliency is just a little bit different. So a resilient grid system can withstand an incoming damaging event, and it can minimize the extent of this disruption and recover quickly to a stable condition. So here's a graph that hopefully can explain this a little bit better. So under normal operating conditions, there's a certain amount of electricity, there's a certain performance in the system. There's a certain amount of electricity that I'm being produced and consumed. The voltage is stable. Things are normal. Even before an event occurs, though, there might be signs, indications that something might be going wrong. And if we're prepared, then we might be able to take actions to prevent that event from even occurring in the first place or mitigating what the consequences are. And when the event strikes, we can ask, well, how significant was the event? How deep is that drop in performance? Has that initial problem cascaded into extensive damage and outages? And then how quickly can the operators respond, diagnose what the problem is, and respond and take corrective actions? And then eventually, how quickly can we bring the system back up to a stable condition and ultimately to the same performance that we started with on the back end? So any of these aspects, if we can improve any of these aspects of the electric power grid system, we have made it more resilient. And it won't surprise you that Argonne is involved in many of these aspects of grid resiliency. We have great expertise in understanding what are the threats to the system: hurricanes, ice storms, earthquakes, cyber attacks, wildfires. We understand what the vulnerabilities of the grid system are. So if there is rain and wind and flooding, what are the components of the grid system that are likely to fail because of that? And remember, it's not just the grid system, it's the other infrastructure as well. What's going to go out in the natural gas system or the telecommunications system that's going to affect my ability to keep the grid operating normally? Argonne does a lot of modeling and creates useful simulation tools to help improve and optimize the response and recovery of these kind of serious events. So what I'd like to do for the rest of the talk is to focus on what Argonne does with respect to emergency readiness and response. So with those deep capabilities that I just mentioned, Argonne is the go-to laboratory for forecasting system damage from any of these kind of man-made or natural events and training system operators to be better prepared for emergencies. And with that, enjoy. Argonne has developed the most extensive and highest resolution U.S. regional climate database. Our simulations can get down to a resolution of 7.5 miles. So that's about the size of Aurora, Illinois, which is pretty impressive. In this study that I show here, we show the increasing risk of fire by the end of the century in terms of an increase in the number of extreme drought days. So for some parts of the country, in some seasons, in the worst case scenario, they may see 80% more days of severe drought than they did at the beginning of the century. So for a region that might have had 20 days of severe drought in the year 2000, by the year 2100, they may see 36 days of severe drought, and that translates directly into fire risk. So our fire risk mapping tool can be used for these kind of long-term climate-based assessments, but they can also be used for near-term weather-based fire risk predictions. Our hurricane damage tool is the federal government's official source for storm impacts from hurricanes. We've been providing this information since 2013. So our tool collects data from updated NOAA National Hurricane Center advisories and translates the wind and the rain and the storm surge information into damage to generators and transmission lines and substations, and then translates that into who's going to be out, what customers are going to be without power. So in that way, the operators and the responders are better prepared to be able to stage their crews and be able to order replacement parts. So here what I'm showing, this is Hurricane Michael, and I'm showing our estimates 2.5 days before landfall. And just to remind you, Hurricane Michael was a Category 5 hurricane that hit the Panhandle. Landfall was on October 10th of last year. By the way, the storm estimate damages for that were $25 billion. So Argonne Estimates is estimating what the customer outages were for this, as we do for every hurricane that is approaching landfall. And in this case, our estimates were particularly good, especially in the early stages of the storm. So by October 11th, so the morning of October 11th, the day after landfall, there were approximately 900,000 customers who were without power, and Argonne's estimate was within about 1% of that. So these same tools can be used not just for emergency response as storms and other disasters are striking, but also for planning for a more resilient grid system. And the best example I have for this is Puerto Rico. So you'll recall that for Puerto Rico, the estimate is that it may cost $132 billion to restore the energy system there. The problem is there isn't $132 billion sitting around. So it's important to be able to prioritize what the investments are to get to the most resilient system that you can. So one suggestion was, hey, how about adding new generation near San Juan at the Palo Seco site? So one thing to know about Puerto Rico is most of the population, and therefore most of the electricity demand, is in the north of the island near San Juan. But most of the power generation is at the south of the island. And so Puerto Rico is vulnerable to disruptions from hurricanes and other storms that knock out these south to north transmission lines, and that makes the population vulnerable. So the idea is if we build new power plants near San Juan, then it may be less likely that, that everyone's going to lose power. And so the Department of Energy asked Argonne to do this kind of study. Because the question is, all right, maybe building power there makes sense, but how much power? 300 megawatts? 1,000 megawatts? 2,000 megawatts? So in the Argonne study, we modeled the system with those different additions of new capacity at Palo Seco, and then rammed a whole bunch of hurricanes against the island to see what's the likely outages going to be under those various future configurations. And the result was that, yes, if you add capacity there, then it is going to make the grid more resilient. But at a certain point, at a certain amount of generation that you're adding there, adding more generation doesn't really give you that much benefit. I add another 100 or 200 megawatts, and the same number of people are still going to be left without power. So why pay that extra expense to build more and more capacity there? So this becomes, as you see, a way of helping to optimize what's the best investments for these kind of situations. To me, the lowest hanging fruit for grid resiliency is training, exercises, and drills. So exercises help operators and responders understand what the steps are during an emergency, including system actions, the communication chains, the procedures. These exercises facilitate discovery. Through these kind of events, you can see where the weak links of the system are. You can generate lessons learned. You can make recommendations for new policies and procedures. In other words, they transform knowledge of the system into experience. And as I've mentioned before, and as you saw in our video, the more realistic these scenarios are, the better the training is, and therefore the better the response is going to be when an emergency actually strikes. So let me walk you through the types of exercises and drills that Argonne has been involved with. And one place to start when you're thinking about developing some sort of training exercise is to ask a couple of questions. One, who are the players who need to be involved? You probably certainly want the system operators, the grid operators, first responders. You may want community groups, government officials. You may want some of the vendors involved. So think about the range of the scope of what this exercise is going to be. The second question is, what exactly are the objectives of the exercise? Are you simply looking at making sure that your preparation plans are adequate, or do you also want to exercise and understand ways to do better mitigation or better response or better recovery? Once you have those questions settled, then you can think about developing the scenario. So the scenario is, what is this assault that I'm going to make against the system? And as I've said before, you want to make this as realistic as possible. So take advantage of historic events that have actually occurred. Have validated computer models that you can trust in terms of how these events unfold. And then rely on good expertise, of course. So the details of the scenario can include certainly defining what the incident is, but then understanding how does that assault actually affect components of the system. And again, it may not just be the electric power grid system. You may also be looking at natural gas systems and the petroleum systems and other types of infrastructure. And then you want to develop what are called injects. And these are developments that take place as the scenario is unfolding. So there might be a new unexpected disruption. I'm in the middle of a simulated ice storm and the bad guys come in, and this is the time that they're going to throw a cyber attack at you. There may be federal intervention. You probably have to think about human behavior. Can I get the crews to where I need to if the roads are going to be clogged with evacuees? So there are 4 basic types of exercise that I want to talk about this evening, and it's starting with tabletop exercises. As the name implies, it's basically sitting around a table with a facilitator who understands what the scenario is and your players, and talking about what are the appropriate responses to this event. Lessons are developed, and those lessons learned are brought back to the home institutions of those people who are participating in the event. What I'm showing here, by the way, this is the Northeast Power Coordinating Council, the NPCC, and Argonne is working with them to develop a US-Canada cross-border gas-electric disruption. And that's going to be the basis for a tabletop exercise that's going to take place in October of this year. So you can take that tabletop idea and you can extend it into what's called distributed play exercises. So here, the scenarios are distributed to local facilitators in a distributed region who tailor the exercise to the particular needs of the participants at that group. And then all of those sort of local distributed exercises, the lessons learned are then conveyed up to the entire group. And the example that I show here are the GridX exercises. So GridX is a national level distributed play event that's run by the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, NERC. NERC's the organization that sets the standards for reliability for the transmission system in both US and Canada. So among other objectives, GridX is designed to exercise incident response plans to major types of cyber and physical security threats. For GridX 5, which is taking place in November of this year, Argonne co-leads the team that's developing these interdependent infrastructure scenarios. So another example of distributed play events was Operation Power Play that took place here in Illinois just a few months ago. Was anyone either familiar with or involved in Operation Power Play? Maybe not. This was an Illinois-wide event, however, and the scenario included tornadoes, and there was flooding, and there was a coordinated cyber attack at the same time. So it was pretty severe, and it was throughout the state of Illinois. Argonne was involved. We were the organization that developed the cyber attack scenario for Operation Power Play. We also provided a virtual emergency operations center. One thing that's common with many of these types of exercises is to dispatch mock media reporters who have real-world experience, who then provide media reports to the players as if this were a real scenario that was taking place. And Argonne provides a lot of this type of mock media coverage. And I'm going to show you an example.
From the ENN studios, I'm John LaSalle with breaking news. The National Weather Service in Pueblo has issued a flash flood watch for Pueblo County. The area covered by the watch is to the southwest of Pueblo, stretching from the Beulah Valley down to Colorado City. The culprit is a stalled weather system dumping rain along Colorado 165. A flash flood watch is issued when conditions are favorable for flooding. It does not mean that flooding will occur, just that it's possible. A flash flood warning is issued when flooding is imminent or actually occurring, so be prepared. Meanwhile, in eastern Pueblo County, we're seeing posts on social media from weather spotters and motorists about flooding along Colorado 96 from Baxter Road around past Avondale. It definitely looks like conditions will be getting worse before they get any better, so stay off the roads if you can, and if you're outside, well, be extra careful. We'll continue to cover this story as it develops, and when news breaks, we'll bring it to you first from the ENN studios. I'm John LaSalle.
So that's fun. That's the part I like the best, actually. That's fun. All right. So let me turn to this example. What you're seeing here is Hurricane Marie. So Hurricane Marie was a Category 4 hurricane that hit the Texas-Louisiana border. Now, if you haven't heard of Hurricane Marie, there's a reason for that. It's not a real hurricane. This is a simulated hurricane that Argonne created to help the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, MISO, with training exercises for the grid operators. Now, for this scenario, Argonne calculated not just the tornado information, or sorry, the hurricane information, but what the outages were to power generation, transmission lines, substations, telecommunications, onshore and offshore natural gas supplies. And by the way, we supported a similar scenario this spring in 2019. That was Hurricane Olga we made up. So what we're talking about here is dispatcher simulation training. And what happens here is that these scenarios are run through the computerized grid simulators that these organizations have, and then operators run through these scenarios multiple times to try to figure out what is the best way to respond to these kind of events. What kind of actions should they be taking to keep the grid stable? So those actions could include, do we have to have some forced blackouts in some regions? Do we have to curtail power to some industrial customers? Do we use phase shifters to redistribute the current among different transmission lines? And finally, there are national level exercises. And in particular, the Federal Emergency Management Agency runs the national level exercises every 2 years. So these are biannual events that are intended to bring lots of different players together to validate different response procedures that they may have. And it covers the full range of resiliency type topics that we've been talking about. One thing that they're particularly interested in is both business and government continuity under major events. This last event that they held was in 2018. It included 12,000 participants, making it one of the largest government exercises of its type. Argonne was involved. In fact, you'll recognize this graphic from the video that you saw recently. This is Hurricane Cora, which is another simulated hurricane. It's a Category 4 storm that looks like it's headed to Florida, but then veers off into the North Atlantic, and then suddenly makes a left turn and slams into the US Capitol and up into Pennsylvania. Now you can imagine that if you're an operator, well, let me just tell you what Argonne did with this scenario. So once again, we did all of the moment-by-moment analysis of the customer outages and damage to the transmission system, to generation, and to fuel supply and telecommunications. But if you think about this scenario, imagine that you're in the room here. You see this hurricane headed towards Florida. You send your crews down to Florida because you're trying to help your other sibling utilities. So you send a bunch of responders down to Florida, and then the next thing you know, the hurricane is actually hitting landfall up at the U.S. Capitol. So now you have to get all of those crews back up to Baltimore or the Maryland and Virginia area. Can you do that? Are the roads passable? Do you even have telecommunications to be able to have the conversations you need to get everything organized? That's the type of thing, type of scenario that you're exercising in an event like this. So finally, we can't prevent the disasters that are going to disrupt the grid. And in fact, there's every indication that we're going to see more severe events in the future. Heat waves, wildfires, severe storms. But there is a lot we can do to make the grid more resilient, making it hardier against impacts that might strike it, and speeding the recovery when there is some sort of outage. There's a role for government, private agencies, community groups, all to contribute to making the grid more resilient. Because as you've seen, it's not just a matter of technology and hardware, but being prepared for these events is just as important. And Argonne, for our part, we're working hard to work with our concerned stakeholders to try to achieve the maximum resiliency possible for the electric power grid and other infrastructures. Because it's these infrastructures that are just so vital to our health, our economy, and our well-being. So, thank you.
Great, thank you, Mark, very much. It's wonderful even for me to hear the impact of the work that Mark and our wonderful colleagues at Argonne lead, because we know it's reducing risk, we know it's enhancing resilience, we actually know it's saving lives across the continental US and to some of our other partners. So thanks again, Mark, for the wonderful presentation. It's now time to turn it over to you for great questions, if you have them. If you could just please raise your hand and I'll call on you, and wait for a microphone to come so that we can all hear you and the folks online can hear you as well. Sir, please.
Sure. A question. This is great. It's great to see all this sorts of preparation and the work going into that. My question is about what's for our preparedness for something on the order of like the Carrington event or like a massive solar ejection. What do we do?
Okay. So let me describe to the audience what's being referred to here. So back in the 1800s, I can't remember exactly when it was, there was a major solar storm that knocked out telegraph lines. And there have been similar types of geomagnetic disturbances that have occurred more recently that have, now that we have electric power lines everywhere, have actually caused damage in Canada. There was an event a number of decades ago. So there are many people who worry about a major solar storm, that maybe we're due for one. And related to that is there are people who worry about electromagnetic pulses. So if a foreign adversary were to detonate a high altitude nuclear weapon, that could severely disrupt the power grid systems throughout. So there's sort of two levels of work that are taking place, and I should point out that Argonne's really not doing a whole lot of work on these geomagnetic disturbances themselves. However, we do run exercises for these kind of events, but we're not doing a lot of research into the GMD itself. But some things that you can do, some are technological. There are ways of creating power electronics and other types of devices that can withstand those current pulses that are generated in the lines. If there's advance warning, you can actually shut down the lines. So, and that might be possible with solar storms. Might certainly be possible if you see a missile coming your way. Some of these events are quite widespread. So we've been in conversation, for instance, with the state of Wyoming, that and the scenario that they're developing, it basically assumes that the federal government doesn't exist anymore, and Wyoming is on its own. So for instance, in their planning, they think maybe we need to have certain spare parts so that we can rebuild the systems more effectively. It's a pretty serious kind of event that can take place. Does that help?
Yeah, it's a tough question. So.
Yeah. Huh.
Great, thank you.
Right.
We have a question over here with a microphone. Yes, sir, please.
Yeah, I read an article recently about the vulnerability of cities like Tucson and Phoenix, when the temperatures are running above 110 to a power outage. I wonder if you've done any work or scenarios in that area with heat-related problems.
So I'm trying to think. We have studied heat waves. They could do a couple of things. One is the resistance in these components becomes higher, and so you can get you reduce the amount of current that can go through the wires. So that alone kind of reduces your availability of the electric power grid system. And of course, if there's enough sagging, then the lines can fail themselves. They can even spark fires and things like that. Argonne is doing some level of work looking at those risks, especially fire risks, with respect to heat waves. I am not aware, I cannot think of any specific studies that we've done for, say, the Arizona region.
Gentleman in the back, please.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I'm curious, you gave a great example for Puerto Rico about the importance of studying capacity growth for generation. Can you speak to what maybe metrics or analysis is used to compare that and trade that off versus placing more substations or more nodes in that grid? Can you speak to that, please?
Sure, and in fact, if you don't mind, I'm going to even expand your question a little bit. One of the other options that Puerto Rico is seriously looking at is having much more distributed energy generation. So really expanding solar energy, for instance, adding much more battery storage, and I think all of these things would help. If I understood your question, the way I would study those options is they all have a cost associated with them, and I want to understand, is the grid, and I'll use both these words in a very technical way, both reliable and resilient. So what I would look at for reliability is how stable is the system even if I lose one or two or three components of the system. Do I have the, is there the possibility that there will be a cascading failure that will knock out the entire system? And if that depends on just one component, one substation, one transformer, one transmission corridor, then that's not a very reliable system. For resilience, I might look at the kind of studies that I talked about here, where I throw hazards against the event, against the proposed scenarios, and then see which ones are going to lead to the least disruption. And then I can compare those costs to those benefits that you're gaining. And I should tell you that, if it's not clear, we Argonne, we don't make policy recommendations. Tell us what you're interested in doing, and we will analyze it and tell you these are the advantages, these are the disadvantages. All right?
Sure, please.
I think you touched over.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Touched on my question a little bit. I was going to ask, what's the future of distributed energy, and is energy storage the big question?
Yes, you've set me up well. Argonne has a very large program in energy storage, and a lot of that work grew out of the work that we did in battery development for electric vehicles. Now we're trying to apply that capability to grid scale energy storage. But let me get more directly to your question. Every indication is that the price of solar power in particular is coming down rapidly and is in certain parts of the country quite competitive with traditional ways of producing generation. That doesn't mean it is a silver bullet, right? So the costs are perhaps becoming comparable, but now you have questions of, well, how do I handle the fact that there's no sunlight at night? How do I handle when there are serious days of storms and clouds? There are different ways to try to manage that on the grid system. Being able to have a backup generation helps with that. Having a diversified set of generation options helps. Energy storage, if we brought the prices down, would certainly help. There are a number of pilot projects taking place right now, and some utilities are finding it economic to put energy storage in. I'll give you an example. There are some utilities that have to depend on getting their power through the transmission lines. And you pay for that as a utility. You're paying for the peak amount of energy of sort of voltage and current that you're getting from those transmission lines. And you will pay for your highest demand day. So it might be July 20th, and you need this much current coming from that transmission line because I have to run all these air conditioners. Throughout the entire year, you are then stuck with paying for that maximum capacity that you must have from that transmission line. So anything you can do to lower your demand on that one day can save you a ton of money. And that's where utilities are looking at community solar projects and battery storage. And if they can just save that one capacity charge, they can save a lot of money. So there are certain economic conditions around the country that even today battery storage is finding a use. The other example that Argonne is deeply involved with is that there's certain types of facilities, critical functions we would call them, that just cannot afford to have perturbations or outages in the system. Military bases are one example. And so they are heavily looking at battery storage, and Argonne is helping these kind of organizations look at, well, how much battery storage makes sense to you? How would you integrate that with other resources, including solar power, to get the most bang for your buck for those circumstances?
Excellent question so far. I'm excited to get the other side of the room involved. So
Yes.
we'll go to you, then Sir to you, and then we have a question online.
Please.
Thank you, first off, for a very interesting presentation. I was wondering, your mathematical modeling and simulations, are you able to track actual occurrences like this tropical storm that's taking place and use the simulation data and match the actual data points and see how resilient the model is interpreting the results, right? And then you mentioned a severe condition where there is actual weather-related damage going on the system, but there's cyber attacks. So how do you intervene and intersect with the cyber attack scenarios?
Right. So I'm going to sort of parse your question up into a few kind of sub-questions. So let me talk about the sort of validation of this work. So there's two things I want to distinguish when it comes to the weather forecasting. One is whether we are improving the weather predictions themselves. So can we model these? If you saw my Dorian slide, for instance, you saw this wide swath of where it might possibly land. If we could narrow that down, then we could do a better job of, for instance, evacuations in Florida. Does everyone in Florida have to evacuate because of incoming Dorian? Or do we know that if we can say, no, it's just going to be this area, that would help? So we have our weather modelers here, our climatologists and our meteorologists working on that kind of problem. It's a very big data problem. Argonne has some very large computers working on that. My area hasn't gotten too worried about that. What we do on the grid side is we take the forecasts that are coming from the National Hurricane Center, and so they'll tell us what the predicted wind speeds and so forth are. So that part of the question is, how well are our predictions in terms of what the damage is going to be? And to do that, we do go back in history and say, like for Hurricane Michael, we made these predictions ahead of time. Well, we work with those utilities and other government agencies that collect this information and find out, well, okay, what was the actual damage? And then we go back and we recalibrate our codes and try to make those calibrations better. And in fact, one of the reasons I was in conversation with Puerto Rico this morning, not just to check in with them, but was to remind them, we want to get your damage information, right? Because Puerto Rico, their system probably is built, and I think I can say this without contradiction, it's likely that their power lines and their power poles are not as stable as many of the data sets that we have on the mainland. They have vegetation management problems, there's corrosion, there's been some maintenance problems. So there's a suspicion that that winds that might do minimum damage in Florida might do a lot of damage in Puerto Rico. So we're anxious to get whatever data we can from Puerto Rico so that we can make those predictions better. Now I do want to get to your second question, which, incorporating what happens when cyber and these other events occur. So in the kind of training exercises we do, we then model sort of, let's say kind of independently, a cyber attack would cause this damage. And we just kind of presume that damage would take place. For this kind of work, we're not studying, well, what actually did the cyber thing do to make that asset go out? We just kind of presume there was a successful attack, it made this component go out. However, Argonne does have a pretty large cybersecurity program, and we do have people who are working on being able to identify, detect, mitigate, and respond to different kind of cyber attacks. It's not really my area of expertise. Maybe that could be a future OutLoud lecture. So, all right.
Sir, thanks for the patience.
Yes.
Certainly. So I actually work in the engineering department for a public utility in Phoenix, Arizona.
Oh, okay. So, yes.
A couple of questions. So my question for you has to do with the resiliency in Puerto Rico. But first, I want to say the Electric Power Research Institute has been doing and is currently doing extensive research in the field of electromagnetic disturbances and resiliency against those. So EPRI is the entity that's doing extensive research on those. And then regarding Phoenix, when the heat waves come, that actually increases solar output. So the photovoltaic panels currently right now at the rate, they're actually, at least in the greater metro Phoenix area, we're actually adding solar generation faster than we're adding air conditioning load.
Interesting.
So when it gets hotter right now, we actually have to throttle back our gas turbines in the middle of the day.
So I want to understand that, because I want to make sure I understood what I heard you say. So are you getting more solar production out because those hot days are sunny days, or
correct? Well, the reason it's so hot is because the sun's shining so brightly.
But it's not that as it gets hotter, the solar panels become more efficient. That's not the case.
No.
Okay,
But they do put out more.
Because it's a sunny day.
Right, exactly.
All right, good, thank you.
So my question, our utility actually was part of the mutual aid that was sent to Puerto Rico to help rebuild.
Yeah, great.
So we were down there for a number of months. And one of the things that was being done to help rebuild the grid in Puerto Rico was to add significantly more solar and wind generation to support the existing coal and gas and oil fired generation that's there. Which I think is great. It's more renewable, but solar panels become sails and wind turbines become airplane wings when a hurricane hits. And so I'm wondering if your super fancy models that you've done have looked at what happens when all the solar panels and all the and all the wind turbines shut down because the hurricane hits and takes them airborne. As part, so in terms of resilience.
Yeah, right. That is an excellent question. By the way, interestingly, Puerto Rico is not really looking at wind power as that viable. They just the locations just aren't that good. It's mountainous and so mostly what they're looking at are the solar panels. Argonne has not looked at what the fragility of solar panels are. Hey, there's so much wind, what's the likelihood of those going out? Now, we certainly, if someone else were to do that calculation, like our friends at EPRI, then of course we could put that into our models and say, okay, under this wind speed, we would expect these regions to lose their solar panels. So if someone else told us what that number is, then we could put that in. Most of our models, when we talk about generation, we've been looking at the at the centralized transmission level kind of assets, and we tend to go down to the substation. These kind of models have not been looking so much at what's happening at the distribution level so far. But as you point out, and as I kind of pointed out before, this blending of the two systems, it's an area we're going to have to get into. So that was an excellent question. Thank you.
Two quick responses before we go to an online question. One is super fancy is a technical term we use internally as well for our models.
Yeah.
And then two, sir, I assume you traveled from Arizona specifically for this OutLoud, so thank you very much. Good. Online question, please.
We in fact, we're going to the PETA super fancy right. Computer. That's the next step beyond super.
Worth it.
We cannot wait.
I seem to have lost it, so if someone else has
Yeah, I know a gentleman has a microphone over there. Please, go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I had a general question. I too also just retired with 33 years in the utility industry. All of it on the distribution side.
Locally here?
Yeah. Here.
Oh, great.
Looking at your models, I could tell most of that's transmission and above probably.
Yeah.
And one of the things I noticed, one of my jobs was I did participate in the restoration process. As a matter of fact, I was one of the first ones to allocate where the crew should go. I would analyze the data coming in. But some of the hurricanes really stressed our utility after the fact. I also worked in new business, and materials were short supply. Our contractors all left to go to we depend on contractors so much now. So my question is, have you modeled a catastrophic event like a fire or earthquake in California and a hurricane? To me, I think that would be the most devastating thing for our country, just based on materials and human resources.
This question of the supply chains really came up in Puerto Rico. When Con Ed went down from New York as well, I was talking with some of their response people in Puerto Rico, and they had the new towers that they brought in. They didn't have the anchor bolts, so they had to have a cargo plane.
Basic components
components that they thought would be available on the island, they had to ship in. It was really something. So this whole idea of sort of supply logistics, and actually Dave's division has some folks who look at emergency response for the Defense Department, right, on those kind of issues.
Going to pay the manufacturers to stock the extra supply, that kind of stuff, right?
Right. Now, I want to answer your other question, though, which was, hey, have you ever, studied, like, I don't know, San Andreas Fault or something like that?
Do you have any data on what's the odds of that even happening?
So we do these studies when there is an agency that asks us to do these studies. So you notice that the earthquake example that I showed was for the New Madrid Fault, which is in southern Illinois, goes down into Arkansas and Tennessee. That's because FEMA asked us, they said, hey, this is going to be our next exercise. Now when FEMA decides to do the San Andreas Fault, likely they'll come to us and ask us to analyze that, but we have not done that yet.
Great to know that you guys are looking at it, though.
Yeah. Oh,
I did have one comment, if I could, about the solar. I don't know if I got this close enough. The solar energy and so forth. Just don't forget, if you needed that demand just because you reduced it today, if you're ever going to need it, that's where utilities have a challenge being able to supply that demand if it's ever needed.
It is, that's.
Let's go to our online question, and the gentleman in the front row too. We'll go there, then to the gentleman in the front row.
So Mark, you gave the example of the interconnectedness of natural gas pipelines and power generators, given that so much of U.S. power generation is based on gas turbines, but more and more alternative distributed generation sources are coming online and these generators are dependent on telecommunications infrastructure to supply information about generation supply and demand.
Yes.
How difficult of an issue is this to grid resiliency?
Yeah. That is an excellent question. Thank you out in the ether world for that question. So I mentioned that telecommunications is one of these infrastructures that Argonne looks at when it thinks about these interdependencies. And so we study cell towers and microwave communication, satellite communication, fiber links, and so forth. And it is true that if you lose telecommunications, you lose your observability of the system. This was an issue that came up in Puerto Rico as well, that the utility and the main control centers were all up in San Juan, but because all the communications went out, they had no idea what was happening at the south end of the island. Remember, that's where all the generation was. So they had almost zero ability to manage what needs to be done where without that communication. So yes, I do think that as we get more distributed generation that requires what I might call an Internet of Things type array of each of those components talking with each other and then talking to some sort of centralized system, that also becomes a possible vulnerability of the system. If I lose that communication, then I might lose all of that generation, or at least the ability to control it.
I think the microphone's found its way over there, and then, sir, we'll go to you in the front row after that, okay?
This is mostly of a outside thought because I have no specialties in this type of range. It might even not be considered part of this lecture, but what would be like, how would you like get communications, like what would, if communications are down, what is your method to communicate with others?
Aha, okay, so these are examples of what would actually, that would be a question that would come up in one of these exercises. We would come in, because remember, we're in one of these exercises, moment by moment, we're telling the players, oh, by the way, you can't talk on the phone anymore, right? And they don't know that's coming, right? They don't know what our scenario is ahead of time. But it's hour 2, communications is out. Now what are you going to do? And so many of these companies have redundant systems to try to allow for communications. They might have satellite phones, for instance. But one of the things that we discovered is the satellite phones don't work in the bunker where the emergency centers are. So people would have to run upstairs, go outside, get on the satellite phone, and then run downstairs and tell people what the answer was. But the utilities might also have like fiber systems to connect very important nodes within their system. So there'll be a number of redundancies that people will put into the system. But one thing these exercises will do is they'll let you know that there's some common cause failure. If this thing goes out, if I didn't have that fiber system and I lost cell phone communication and you have no other way of communicating, well, that might make you think, maybe I need to put in a fiber system. So, yeah, good question.
We have time for just a few more questions. So, sir, you've been very patient. I appreciate it.
Okay, I have obviously there's some things that we absolutely know are coming. We know there's going to be a big rollout of electric cars over the next 5 or 10 years. But what about some of the things that are more in the unicorn or blue sky kind of thing? For example, what are we going to do with all of those nuclear power plants when we have to decommission them? Will we have a new generation of nukes come online? Beyond that, what if the fusion people actually succeed in, generating electricity through fusion? Or what if you develop a high temperature conduction line, like
right, superconductor, right.
Transmission lines.
Right.
So can you speak to some of those long-term unicorn type things? As well as,
you're asking me to make predictions? One area that people here at the lab have been telling me about that gets me kind of excited is the possibility of microreactors. So we talk about, the typical power plants today are, 1,000 megawatts. And for some time, people have been talking about small modular reactors. Those might be, 50 to 200 megawatts, something like that. But nowadays, I'm hearing people talk about microreactors that are so small and so self-contained, you could put them just about anywhere. And that almost, and if that were to happen, and people were to allow that, and the regulations would allow it, and the technologies that, all these things that I haven't been following that closely myself, but if this were to come to pass, then there's an interesting set of studies on the grid side of what's the optimal way to deploy those things to make the grid more resilient. How might you be able to use those to bolster the resiliency of the grid? Again, if you're asking me whether these things are going to come to pass, I can't tell you. Let's see, what were some of your other options? Oh, fusion power. I don't expect to see fusion power anytime soon, let's put it that way. Where we have not hit break even yet, it will be decades before you would even have the possibility of seeing fusion on the system. And if we're worried about climate change, I think we have to do something more urgent than that. That's not to say we shouldn't do research that 70 years from now, 80 years from now, that might be important. I just don't see that coming in the next 20 years. So superconductivity, it's another area. I haven't followed that closely, but from what little I know, I haven't seen significant increases in temperatures on those. There was a while, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago, where every other week you were seeing new records being made in higher and higher temperature superconductors, some that could make it to almost liquid nitrogen type temperatures. I've seen nothing in recent years to indicate that we're close to coming to, say, room temperature superconductivity. This is not let me be clear, this is not my area, and there may be scientists here at Argonne who would disagree with me. I just haven't run across anything like that in the literature. So my perception is I don't see that coming anytime soon either. Did you have another, was there another one in the? Battery breakthroughs. Oh, now battery breakthroughs. That I think we're certainly going to see. So one thing that we've seen is that the manufacturing costs, once you start scaling these things up from a manufacturing perspective, the costs come way down. We're seeing that with lithium-ion batteries. We think that there's going to be a new generation of batteries that go beyond lithium-ion, and I don't remember what all the chemistries are, but there are different chemistries that can be looked at that we can get even more juice out of these things, and that really would be a game changer. So I would like to think over the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to see some major changes in the battery market, or at least in the battery research. How long these things take to get to market, I couldn't say. But there's definitely a lot of very interesting research and promising research going on in that area. Okay.
Sir, you have the extreme honor of being our final question today. So please.
You've alluded to the smart grid, and one of the telecommunications is a vulnerability. And it seems to me one of the advantages of smart grid is to prevent the cascading effects like we've seen in the past. Can you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I do tend to think of that. When I hear the phrase smart grid, I'm mostly thinking about on the distribution side of things. Although there are synchrophasers and other technologies on the transmission side.
Distributed power like wind and solar,
yep.
et cetera.
Yep. Let's see, remind me the question again, that where the future of smart grid is, or what the vulnerabilities are? I'm sorry.
What's your understanding of the state of the art right now, and how that's going to shake out in the future, and because it should increase reliability.
Oh yes, all right, that's right. Yes, I do believe that that's the case with more and more communications. So one thing, for instance, that the utilities can do today that was very difficult for them to do before is to localize where the problems are. So you remember before, I would have to call the utility and tell them that my power is out. Now they're almost telling me before I know it. I get a text saying, oh, by the way, your power will be back on in an hour. That's because they immediately know where those faults are. One area that they still have trouble with, though, is when there's a wide area outage, like from a storm. They can only see up to that last pole that's still standing. They know there's a problem there, but they don't know how many additional problems are out beyond that. They'll fix this pole, but you know what? 3 other poles are down too. So they're very interested in trying to find technologies, including communications and sensors, that would let them kind of bypass this problem here and identify, hey, there's 5 other problems down the line. So maybe there's some technologies like that coming. One area that I think we will see growth in is microgrids. So these are sort of independent systems that can isolate themselves from the main electric distribution system in an emergency. So this would include a combination of energy storage and energy generation that can be used on a campus or in a neighborhood or at a hospital. And you can also imagine that once there are more and more of these microgrids, then you might have arrays of microgrids that can all share resources. Hey, I have power in my microgrid, and so I'm keeping my facility and campus going. And I might have some spare power so that I can ship some power to you and get you back up and running again too. So I think the future is going to be quite interesting, and all of that depends on this kind of communication and control.
You're talking about similar to the way internet is able to route around damage.
Yeah, that's actually a good way to think of it.
Thank you for the wonderful questions. Can you please, one more round of applause? Thank you, Dr. Petri.
All right.
If you didn't get a chance to ask your question, Dr. Petri's graciously offered to stay for a little while to answer a few more, but please go easy on him. I think we were in the same 8 a.m. meeting this morning. So we had a long day.
It was a budget meeting of all things.
So go easy. We will be sending out a survey, so we look forward to your feedback, both about this particular event, but also learn a little bit about yourselves as well. Please don't forget to get a refreshment on the way out if there's anything left. And again, thanks for the wonderful questions. Thanks for your great attention. It was our pleasure to have you here tonight. And thanks very much. Be safe going home. Thank you.